to All About Icing. I'm Barbara Evans, owner of Stable Mabel Cake Support Systems and the Wedding Cake Connection in Central Illinois. I'm thrilled that you've joined us for this weekend. It certainly wasn't the ICES convention that we had planned on, but thanks to our wonderful board of directors, they came up with a way for all of us to gather one way or another. I hope you enjoy the video. I will be doing several different kinds of icing, and hopefully you'll pick up a tip or a trick that will really be something that you'll hang on to for a long time. Enjoy the weekend. If you would like to print out the recipes that I am using today, you can go to my website at stablemabel.com and you will find a link to print the recipes. We're going to begin with royal icing. Royal icing is an icing that is used for a number of different uses. It can be used for string work or flooding cookies, and so it's basically made up of two ingredients, and those ingredients are powdered sugar and egg white, and you can make it a number of different ways, but I'm going to take a really simple approach, and I'm going to start with my sifted powdered sugar, adding that to the bowl, and then I'm going to use dried meringue or dried egg whites, and I'm just going to add that into the sifted powdered sugar and then whisk this together. You want to blend it fairly well, and then I'm going to take some hot water and add the hot water to the mixture and then just stir that together. And I can even just use my paddle and just stir this mixture together. Now, when we're talking about meringue powder versus dried egg white, meringue powder can have a variety of different ingredients in it, and so I suggest that you just stay with dried egg whites, because meringue powders, it may have granulated sugar, it may have powdered sugar, it may even have gelatin in some cases. So when we go with just the dried egg white, then we know that we're just focusing on the ingredient that we want and not having any additional ingredients. So at this point, I just have, I've made this into kind of a slurry. We'll scoot this over, get a better picture of it. So I have this slurry, and I can put this on my mixer now and just beat it to the consistency that I want it to be. But the important part is that you make sure that you do this by hand until you have this slurry, because what we've done is we've just melted the ingredients together, and so they're well combined. So I'll pop this on my mixer, and I'm going to give it about 4 or 5 minutes on a medium speed. I'm going to go ahead and just scrape this down. So all of my utensils are, we want to have them as grease-free as possible. So before I started with all of my utensils, I wipe them down with white vinegar. You want to be careful not to use a rubber spatula or a silicone spatula, because they may have residual grease that they have with them, and so I'm just using like a hard plastic spatula. So get this going, and we'll be back in about 3 minutes. So I have this royal icing just about to the consistency that I'm looking for. It's kind of a medium peak. Show you what it looks like here. And this would be very good for piping, if you're going to cover the cake with this icing, then you're going to need to look for a recipe that's going to include glycerin. If you're going to color this icing, you probably want to avoid glycerin. So the glycerin is going to make it a little bit softer so that when you go to cut the cake, it allows you to cut through it. But if you're doing string work or doing cookies or something like that, you probably don't want the glycerin in there. So you want to be sure that you look for either a paste or a liquid color that does not include glycerin. When you're using your icing, it's going to dry out quickly, so you need to keep it covered. So just keep the bowl covered with a damp cloth. And when you go to store your icing, look for a container that is going to be about the size of the actual amount of icing that you have, so you don't have a great big container and a little small amount of icing. And then put some plastic wrap right down on the surface of the icing, and then put a wet paper towel on top of the plastic wrap with a lid, and then that will store it nicely. You can refrigerate it for up to a week. You can also freeze it. And if you freeze it, then just pull it out of the freezer and defrost it in the refrigerator, and you should be good to go. You'll need to rebeat it, of course. So this is our royal icing. Cream cheese icing is definitely a crowd favorite. Every time somebody calls and says, "I want red velvet cupcakes," and I say to myself, "You want cream cheese icing, you just aren't thinking in those terms." So when you're making cream cheese icing, there are definitely some tricks to it, and if you've ever made cream cheese soup, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When you make cream cheese icing, sometimes it can get very thin and runny. So what is the method to the cream cheese to keep it from becoming runny? So what we want to do is we're going to start with our ingredients. We have powdered sugar and butter, preferably a high-fat butter, vanilla, and your cream cheese. So the cream cheese is super important here. Don't go with low-fat cream cheese, because what's been added there is water, and water is going to be the enemy when you're trying to make this non-runny cream cheese icing. So I start by actually taking my cream cheese out of the package, put it onto a paper towel, and let it drain a little bit. You're going to be surprised. It's actually going to pick up a little bit of water onto the paper towel, and it's going to perform better for you if you can get rid of even just that little bit of water. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the butter and the powdered sugar. And I'm going to add my butter into my mixer. Now my butter is going to be room temp. You don't want it to be too soft, or it's not going to whip the way that we need it to. However, if it's too cold, it's just going to be chunky. Probably a little cold is better than too soft, because too cold it will eventually warm up. Too soft it's not going to go the other direction. So we're going to start by beating the butter, and I'm going to put just the butter into the mixer at first. So just whip it until it's blended, and then we're going to add in the powdered sugar. It doesn't have to be completely broken down. And then I will add the powdered sugar in. And I want to be sure and scrape the bottom of the bowl so all of the butter becomes incorporated with the sugar. And by doing this, if I can incorporate a little bit of the butter into the sugar at this point, hopefully I'll avoid the cloud of powdered sugar that's going to come my way. So we'll stick this back on the mixer. Knock that butter off the whisk. Pretty good start. this is where it helps a lot if your mixer starts on slow. Okay, so I'm going to let this beat until this does become kind of light and fluffy. At the same time, I'm going to put the cream cheese into a second bowl. And I'm going to mix this with my paddle just until it's creamy. I just really want to break it down so it's not chunky when I add it into the butter and sugar mixture. So I've beaten my butter and powdered sugar to a point where the butter and the powdered sugar are light and fluffy. I'm going to now add that into my cream cheese. So I also beat the cream cheese, but I would say probably only for about less than a minute. We don't want to beat the heck out of this. We just want to basically take the lumps out of it. So I'm going to then remove my whip with the butter and the powdered sugar, and then I'm just going to transfer this into the bowl with the cream cheese using a paddle. So I'm just going to blend this together. I don't want to over mix it, because if I over mix it, I'm going to take the risk of it being soupy. I'll also blend in the vanilla at this point. I'm going to let it blend for just a few seconds, and then I'm going to knock it all off of my paddle. Start again. And I really want to just mix it at this point until it's incorporated. I'm not trying to fluff it up by any means. And you can see that I have it on a fairly low speed as well. Okay, so there is my cream cheese icing. You can see that it is stiff enough that I can easily ice my cake. I can ice my cupcakes. It's not going to be running all over the place. I can even pipe with this. So there you go. Separate your cream cheese from the sugar, and you'll be a happy camper with cream cheese, right? In keeping with the cream cheese, another one of my favorites is this whipped cream and cream cheese combination. It's really great for things like cupcakes or angel food cake because it's light, and I really enjoy it. So I'm going to start by taking my cream cheese and adding it to the bowl, and I really just want to mix it a little bit so that it breaks down just a bit. I'm using my whisk. And then I'm going to add heavy whipping cream and just blend it into the cream cheese kind of slowly so that they will incorporate. At this point I have the cream and the cream cheese beat together, and it's still very soft, but I'm going to add in my powdered sugar, get that completely incorporated. And then I'm going to beat this to a soft peak. So that is just about where I want it. You can add vanilla to this. You could add a number of other liqueurs or peppermint. So this is a great one to keep in your back pocket. You can see it's super fast, so it takes no time at all. You do need to keep this obviously refrigerated. So that is one cautionary side to this delicious icing. Just a reminder, if you'd like to print the recipes that I'm using today, go to StableMabel.com and look for the link to print the recipes. So chocolate ganache is made up of basically two things. It is heavy cream and chocolate. Now the chocolate can range from milk chocolate all the way up to bitter chocolate, depending on how much sugar is going to be contained in the chocolate that you use. And there are a variety of things that you can add to ganache, lots of liqueurs and other flavorings that you can add. But just to make a basic ganache, I'm going to start off by taking my heavy cream and I'm going to put it over heat so that it just comes to a bubble. And you want to be sure that you avoid bringing this to a boil, because once the cream comes to a boil, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get the ganache to incorporate. So I've brought my cream to a simmer, and I'm going to take it off the heat now and pour it over the chocolate. The chocolate was in the microwave for about 45 seconds on half power, and really all I want to do when I do that is just melt the chocolate, just warming it up a little bit. I don't want to melt it all the way. I'm just maybe melting it 25% of the way or less. And then after I pour my hot cream over the chocolate, I'm going to let that sit for about a minute. And what's going to happen is the hot cream is then going to begin to melt the chocolate the rest of the way, and it will be easier to emulsify that. After I've gotten the chocolate and the cream blended together, I'm going to add some butter. Now, butter isn't necessary in a ganache recipe, but in this case, it's going to provide what I need to help ice these cakes. So at this point, I'm just going to use a whisk to stir the chocolate and the cream together. And at first it looks like it's not going to come together at all. But then suddenly it just kind of all blends together. And it's nice and creamy. And then I'm going to add in my butter. And my butter is soft, but not melted. Let's kind of break that up into the chocolate and whisk that together as well. This is the point also where if you wanted to add different flavorings, you could do that. So just whisk it until the butter is completely blended in. And that will take care of it. That is going to be my ganache. I will let this cool a little bit and then I will cover it and let this sit for maybe 6 hours or even better overnight. And it's going to be a great consistency to ice my cake. American buttercreams are definitely a popular choice in the US for sure, and growing around the world to some extent. So what I'm going to make today is an American buttercream that actually has a meringue added to it. So there's a lot of different recipes for American buttercream, as I'm sure you're aware. The main ingredient that dictates that it is an American buttercream is the addition of powdered sugar. So if you take a buttercream that's got powdered sugar in it, you've got an American buttercream. I'm going to start by making a meringue, and I'm going to add my water to the pan, also my sugar, and some corn syrup. I want to be sure that all of the sugar gets wet and none of it is sitting dry, so that it will all incorporate. I'm just going to bring this to a boil. This is a recipe that I've played with for many, many years, and so as you go to work with it, you may need to make your own adjustments. I'm just going to stick the lid on while this comes to a boil. If there's any granules of sugar that are left on the side of the pan, it's going to help those wash down and not crystallize on the side of the pan. The addition of the corn syrup is going to prevent crystallization. You could also use invert sugar, which would prevent the crystallization as well. So if you let this sit overnight and went to add it to your buttercream without the addition of the corn syrup, you may find that it has crystallized. So that's going to prevent that from happening. I'm going to add some cold water into my mixing bowl, and when I pour the hot syrup into the cold water, it's going to cool it off a little bit so that I can add the additional meringue powder that I'm going to add in. So usually I don't use meringue powder for like my royal icing, but in this case I do find that I like using meringue powder, although you need to be choosy. For me, I find that either Wilton or the CK brand of meringue powder both work quite well. So I'm just going to add this into the cold water that I have in the pan. And then I'm going to just stir this to allow it to cool down just a little bit. And then I can add my meringue powder. Okay, and then using my whisk, I am going to put this on my mixer. let this beat on high for probably about 5 to 7 minutes. So I have my meringue that is just finishing up here. It's looking good. It's a fairly stiff peak. So, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let that set aside and cool. I want to be sure that it is room temperature when I add it to the buttercream. Okay, so for the rest of the buttercream, I've got my butter, and I'm just going to drop that into the mixer here. Okay, and then I will use my paddle. And I'm just going to break down this butter and whip it a little bit. I'm also going to take my water. So I have hot water, and I have, this is a dried creamer. You can replace this all with milk. I just find this to be a non-dairy option, so it works well for me. I have popcorn salt that I'm going to add into my hot water as well. And the hot water is going to help in getting these two items, both the creamer and the salt, to dissolve. And then I'm just going to stir those with a whisk and also add in my vanilla. So I'm going to start the butter and let that start to cream. After I let this butter cream for a few minutes, I'm going to slowly add in my liquid. The beater that I'm using on here is a paddle with the spatulas attached to it. So I may or may not stop and scrape down the bowl, but if you're not using a beater that has a spatula attached to it, you're definitely going to have to stop and scrape down the bowl a number of times, probably 3 to 4 times while you're doing this. So I'm going to turn the power down to low. I'm going to give this a stir because sometimes the salt has a tendency to sit on the bottom. The reason that I use popcorn salt is that it dissolves much easier. I'm just going to slowly add this in until it incorporates into the butter. So I have all of the liquid incorporated into the butter, and so now I'm going to add my powdered sugar. So I'm going to do this in steps, and I'm not going to take you with me on all the steps because it's going to take several steps to incorporate this. So I will continue to incorporate all of my powdered sugar into the icing, and I'll check back in with you when I've got it all in there. So I've incorporated all of the powdered sugar, and now I'm going to just add the meringue into the buttercream that I have here. I'm just going to add it into the top and let it work its way down. kind of slowly. It's a little bit of a messy process, I'll admit that. The meringue's going to lighten the color of the icing, as well as kind of lighten up the taste. So a couple of things that I want to mention about this icing recipe. First of all, this is a 5-quart bowl, and you can see that it's quite full. So if you are using a 4-quart bowl, you're going to need to adjust the recipe. Another thing is that this icing is quite soft. So if you're used to using something that's quite firm, and you want to try this, I would encourage you to try it, but don't try it on tomorrow's wedding cake. Try it when you can find out whether it's going to be something that works for you. You can easily freeze it. You can definitely refrigerate it and keep it for a week or 10 days, but you can also freeze it, which is really handy. Put it in the freezer, and if you have, best is to defrost it in the refrigerator for a couple of days and just rebeat it, and I think you'll find that it beats up quite nice after you've taken it out of the freezer. So I hope you enjoy this recipe, and we're going to move on to a couple of more buttercream recipes, so stick around. Sharon Zambito of Sugar Ed Productions has developed a 2-part buttercream method that has really revolutionized the world of buttercream cakes. The first part of the method is how to work with your buttercream icing to basically get it to be smooth and creamy before you apply it. And the way you do that is to basically overfill the bowl. So you've got your first batch of icing. It kind of takes 2 batches of icing almost. So you've got your first batch of icing in the bowl, and then you're going to add in more icing on top of that until you get it all the way to the top of the bowl, all the way to the top of the paddle. So right where the paddle, kind of the neck of the paddle is, you want to fill the bowl that full. So her 2-part process, the second part really applies more to cakes, which I'm going to show you in a second. But I want to show you how this first part, when you turn the icing on, it's going to basically create a vacuum that is going to pull all the air bubbles out. So when you see the top of the icing, as you see here, you're going to see that it's kind of billowing on the top of the icing. And then you end up with this smooth and creamy icing that is super easy to use. So let me run this for just a few seconds so you can take another look. So I want to show you what that actually looks like when we pull this out. I think you can probably see how smooth the top of the icing is and how creamy it is and how easy it's going to be to work with this icing. Okay, So that's step one. And the important thing is that you have to get it full enough, and then you need to run it for about 5 minutes on medium speed with a paddle to pull all that air out. The second part of Sharon's method involves icing the cake. And the concept is just such a great idea. You just simply take a board that's larger than the cake and use the edge of that board to guide your scraper to get very straight sides. It works like a dream. So in this case, I'm using the oversized Stable Mabel board, and I'm just going to kind of over ice this cake. So I'm going to add more icing than I really need on here, and then I will remove the excess. The tools that I'm going to use are going to be a straight edge scraper, and I don't know the particular brand of this large scraper that I'm going to use. But the important thing about it is that it does not have a handle that impedes the turntable. So you need to be able to rest the actual edge of the blade onto the turntable as you go, so that you can get a nice straight side. If the handle is in the way, then that creates a bit of a problem. So I'm going to do this kind of quickly here. And then I want to be sure, I have a tendency to leave the top a little bit shy, so I'll double hit that. Okay, and then this top edge is going to be important as well. I want to be sure that I don't leave any divots in the top edge. Okay. Now you can see that this is iced fuller than it actually needs to be. And at this point I'm going to take my scraper, and this is where that edge has got to sit flat right there on the edge of the turntable, and the turntable needs to be large enough to support the actual scraper so that it's sitting even. If I don't have that support, I'm going to be at the mercy of me trying to figure out what is level. So I'm just going to give this a quick spin. And you can see how much excess icing I'm removing. You want to be careful not to tip this in. It needs to remain level, and just pull off that excess icing. In a matter of just a couple of seconds, you have this beautifully straight edge on this cake, and you're well on your way to having this cake look just the way you want it to. Then I'm going to take this tool that I have really grown to love. This is a tool by Evil Cake Genius, and it's called the Frostinator. This may or may not be necessary. I really have grown to like this tool, and as you can see, what it's going to do is it's going to edge that top edge for me. Give it a couple of turns here, and then again I'm just going to remove that excess icing. Then I'm going to go to my scraper, if I can get a hold of it here. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to just run, this is a very lightweight, this is actually a Stable Mabel scraper as well. And I'm just going to finish off this side edge. I'm almost not touching it. You can see how much I've taken off this time. It's relatively very, very, very little, almost nothing. So I've got just a couple of spots that I want to fill in down here on the bottom. And then I'm going to use my scraper and just kind of drag over into the center and remove this excess icing here. So I've got the top pretty much there. And then I'm going to give the sides one more swipe here. And then I'll pull this in one more time. So in just a matter of a very few minutes, I've gone from 0 to finished, and it's all because of that great idea of being able to put that scraper against there and use it as a guide, and also thanks to the other products that made it a little bit easier. So the Zambito Method. Sharon, thank you. You have saved so many of us so much frustration and so much time. Well, now we're taking our buttercream adventure to Switzerland, and we're going to make some Swiss buttercream. So I will start with very identical ingredients to the Italian buttercream, but a different procedure in terms of getting there. So I have my egg white and my granulated sugar, and I'm going to drop those right into my mixing bowl. And I will put this over the heat and use this as a double boiler. And I'm going to stir this mixture pretty constantly. I'm going to switch out for this whisk for a second. I want to stir this because I have found that the only real trick to Swiss buttercream, or the one that I think is most important, is the fact that you need to keep this mixture moving while it's in the pan. If you let it just sit, initially it might be okay, although the top band of this pan is going to be a little bit hot, and so it may heat up a little bit more. But what we want to avoid, obviously, is making scrambled eggs in here. You can take this mixture to a variety of different temperatures. The health department says that eggs need to be 135 degrees to be safe. So I've seen recipes that say heat it to 115 degrees, heat it to 125 degrees. I'm going to take it to somewhere between 145 and 150. I've seen it as high as 160. So what happens is that you absolutely need to get the granulated sugar to dissolve. That's what we're going for. And as you go, you're gonna feel that it becomes more fluid and it stirs more easily in the pan. So right now I'm at 130. So it doesn't take long. So I'm at 140. And I'm at 150. So I'm going to take it off. that off. I am going to set it into this water bath for just about 30 seconds, just to take the temp down a bit so that I can cut back on the amount of time that it's going to take for this to whip. So at this point I have this very fluid mixture that has foam on top. It's not that I've tried to whip the mixture as I was going. I really just am trying to avoid it overcooking. And I just felt the bottom of that. I think I'm going to set it in here for just a couple more seconds. Just take advantage of that ice bath. And then I'm going to put the whip on and turn this on. I'll time it and let you know how many minutes it takes for it to beat. Normally this takes probably a good 15 minutes if it's that hot, because it beats up fast, but then it's gonna stay hot, so you've got to bring that temperature down. So because I've already brought the temperature down, it's going to go a little bit faster. So it's taken about 6 minutes for this to beat, which is considerably less than what it would have been had I not brought the temp down. So at this point I'm going to add the butter in. The butter is soft room temp, and you don't want it melted, so be careful of that, because you don't want to change the composition of the butter by putting it and melting it in the microwave. But if you put it in on 50% power for a few bursts at a time, you can bring the temp on the butter down. But the best scenario is just to have it sit out and have it be ready. I cut it into chunks, so I'm going to add it kind of slow and let it incorporate into my icing as we go. I'm going to add this vanilla in. You can also change this to the whip at this point if you prefer. It'll avoid incorporating, more air than you may want. So if the icing looks a little chunky, it just hasn't broken up all the butter yet, no worries, you'll get there. And then it just kind of magically all pulls together and turns into this beautiful buttercream. There's a variety of different recipes that you can use to either raise or lower the sweet level of it. So there's lots of recipes out there, so be aware that you can definitely look for something that's the sweet level that you're looking for. So next we're going to go on to Italy, where we're going to end up with a very similar end result, but a different process. So for our next buttercream, we'll be going to Italy. Might as well make our way around the world, right? So I'm going to start with basically the same ingredients. I've got granulated sugar, egg white, vanilla, butter, and in this case we're going to use water. So to start with, I want to point out that your egg whites need to be warmed up just a little bit, and I hesitate to say that because I don't want you to like warm them in terms of like the microwave or anything, but I want to bring them actually higher than room temperature. So we're going to set this bowl in. So I've got a second thermometer here, and I'm just going to get a read on, currently these egg whites are 68 degrees. So I'm going to just put them into my mixing bowl and just stir them around a little bit. Just give them a swirl with my thermometer. Just don't touch the edge of it, right? Okay, so I've got this sitting in hot tap water, and it's bringing the temperature up pretty rapidly. I'm already at 73, 75. I want to get the chill off of them, so I'm going to bring it up. Just going to let that sit there for a minute. So it's at 79. The more I swirl it, 81. So I'll let it sit there for a second. Okay, so the butter's going to be the last thing we're going to use, so we're going to set that off to the side. I'm going to start by adding my water into my saucepan here. We'll get this going. And then I'm going to add the sugar, and I'm going to be careful not to get the sugar on the sides of the pan. I also don't want any of the sugar to be dry. So I'm going to kind of distribute it evenly if I can. Let that water soak up the sugar. So my pan has been, it's very clean. It has no grease, and then I've also wiped out my my bowl and my whisk with white vinegar. So I'm using a grease-free spatula to just move this around a little bit, trying to avoid getting anything on the sides of the pan. And I'm going to get this started. And I'm going to stick the lid on and let that wash down the sides. You can also take a pastry brush and dip it in some water and wash down the sides to if you've got any additional sugar on the sides. So this has come up to 84 degrees, which should work just fine. So I'm going to get rid of this thermometer, and I'll wipe off the bottom of this bowl. And I will get this started just kind of on low. We're going to take this to 244 degrees. You can go as high as 251 degrees. If you do that, you need to be sure that these egg whites are warm, because if you go as high as 251, you have your egg whites here. If they're cold, they will become strings. They will become egg strings on you. So be careful there. We're going to let these eggs get kind of foamy and just starting to be whipped together. Watch pot never boils, you know. So I have my butter. It has been cut into small pieces, and I'm going to add it in the same fashion that we did with the Italian buttercream, or the Swiss, excuse me. All right. At 235. You don't want to touch the bottom of the pan with the thermometer because you'll get an inaccurate reading that way. So we are at 245 is what I took it to. And then at this point I'm going to pour this down into the sugar while it's continuing to spin. I need to be sure that I don't hit the whisk, because if I hit the whisk it's going to send shards of sugar out and it's going to crystallize. So I need to not and to keep it close enough to the side of the pan or the bowl to not hit the whisk. And I prefer not to run it down the side of the pan if I can avoid it. But it's better to run it down the side of the pan than it is to hit the whisk. See how much the volume comes up as the syrup comes in. And we're going to turn this speed up, and you can put an ice bath under here to cool that down, or an ice pack to bring the temperature down. So we'll let this run, and when it's ready for the butter, I'll come back and join you. Okay, so our meringue is almost ready. It is pretty much ready for the butter. What I did was, to cool it down for my ice bath, I put a cake pan underneath the mixer with some ice in it, and then poured a little water in and let that sit up in there to bring the temp down a little bit. So I wanted to show you the difference if we had the butter a little bit warmer. I'm going to go ahead and put this vanilla in here. If the butter is a little bit warmer, and I just stuck it in the microwave on half power for just a couple of minutes, and you can see that it's not super soft, but it's fairly soft. So when I add this in with it being a little bit warmer, it's going to incorporate really quick. We'll see what happens here. Still just a tiny bit warm. You want it to be almost room temperature so that when you add the butter in, you don't want the butter obviously to melt. So with the Swiss, we had kind of the opposite setting of what I have here. So here we've added the butter in, and with the Swiss it was a little bit cold, so it looked a little bit chunky, a little bit more like cottage cheese. And in this case, it's a little bit warmer, so it's going to have to cool down a little bit. It's kind of going the opposite direction. But then all of a sudden it comes together. So you can see that it's changing the consistency in the mixer kind of right before your eyes. So I'm going to stop and scrape this down, and I want to be sure that I get the very bottom of the bowl, because there may be meringue around the edges of the bowl and the very bottom. This is pretty well together. It just needs to come down a couple of degrees. And at this point, I'm going to switch over to my paddle, just because I don't really want to incorporate a whole lot of air into this at this point. So that's looking pretty good. I think we're good to go. Again, it's light and fluffy. Probably let this cool down just a tiny bit more before I would use it, just because it's going to be easier to apply if I give it a few minutes. Just at room temperature. You don't need to stick it in the fridge. It'll be fine. Of course, as you ice your cake, the easiest way to do it would be to crumb coat it, stick it in the fridge, stick the cake in the fridge, let it get chilled, and then bring it back out. So here we have our beautifully tasty Italian buttercream. Okay, well, I think that does it for buttercreams, but we have one or two more things to come. so don't go away. Next, I want to share with you an icing that I have come up with that I really like for piping flowers. And these are the light and airy buttercream flowers that you see that have become so popular. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with equal parts of butter, and the butter is room temperature, and powdered sugar. And so in this case, I have 8 ounces of 8 ounces of each, and I'm just going to get the butter started. Just break it up just a little bit. That's good. And then I'm just going to add my powdered sugar in. And I'm going to let this mix about 4 or 5 minutes. And so we will come back in 4 or 5 minutes and I'll show you what I'm going to do then. Okay, so it's been about 4 minutes, and the icing is very light in color. Slow it down a little bit so that you can see. It's light and fluffy and light in color. And at this point, I'm going to take some of that Italian buttercream or the Swiss, doesn't matter, either way. And I'm going to mix it about 50-50 in terms of volume. So not necessarily weight, because this one's going to weigh more because this one has more air incorporated. So I'm just going to stop the mixer, and I will add the other buttercream in with it. And if you've ever tried to pipe with either Italian or Swiss, it can be a bit of a challenge. But I think if you give this a shot, just gonna incorporate this a little bit by hand first. And I'll put it back on the mixer. If everything is the same temperature or the same thickness, everything emulsifies better. It all blends, it all just blends better. So keep that in mind. All right, so I'm just going to blend this for about a minute. I don't want to incorporate tons of air into it because I'm going to use it to pipe with. Okay, so I think that should do it. So I'll let you take a look at this icing. That is really nice to pipe with. It's a little hard to tell from this direction, but give it a try. You may enjoy it as well. So tell me, have you ever tried to make stabilized whipping cream and ended up with little marbles in your whipping cream? I recently found a post by Liz Merrick, thank you very much, Liz, and figured out what I was doing wrong. And it is such a simple solution, I had to share it with you. Okay, so to start with, whenever you're going to whip your cream, I'm just starting with heavy cream, and I have chilled the bowl, chilled the cream in the bowl, chilled the whip. So this is all going to go onto the mixer. And I'm going to stabilize this with gelatin. So I have my gelatin. This is just powdered gelatin. Pour it over cold water and let it bloom. So I've already done that. This is my bloomed gelatin. It gets kind of thick, and I'm going to pop this in the microwave for about 5 seconds. Just enough to melt. Just enough to melt it so it becomes fluid. You don't want it to get hot. Check it. Give it about 2 more seconds. It's still a little cloudy and I want it to be clear. Okay, perfect. Now, here's the trick. I'm going to take a tablespoon of the cold whipping cream, and I'm going to temper it into my gelatin and stir this together. It's going to cool down the gelatin and prevent it from creating little marbles in my whipping cream. Okay, so at this point we're going to whip this cream. Just a little bit, and then I'm going to add in the gelatin and cream mixture. I'm going to let that beat, and then just before it's done, I'm going to turn it off and add the powdered sugar and vanilla. Okay, my whipping cream is at a soft peak, a very soft peak, and I am going to go ahead and add in the powdered sugar. And my vanilla. Scrape that down just a little bit. Make sure you get that bottom. Next thing you don't want to do is you don't want to turn this into butter. So don't let it go too far. I think that should do it. Get this, there we go. And we have our stabilized whipping cream. So this you can pipe with, you can, it's great to ice like an angel food cake or any variety of different desserts. You could layer it and make a lovely dessert. So there you have it. No marbles. How about it? I'd like to thank you for joining me at this most unusual ICES convention. Stay well, and I hope to see you all very soon.